Hi, welcome to the condensed consent 101 version. I have a longer, more full version available. You can find it probably linked somewhere on the webpage you found this one, or on my regular webpage, CherylMBradshaw.com. Now, this course I've put together specifically as a short format, hitting most of the major points. It won't go as in depth. There won't be as many handouts, so there won't be as many sort of worksheets and opportunities to practice and learn. But it will do is it'll get you kind of going and covering the stuff a little bit faster. And if this is something you're using as kind of review, then you're going to get everything kind of overviewed, kind of looked at from where you might have started. So quick introduction. My name is Cheryl Bradshaw. I'm the author of the book, Real Talk About Sex and Consent. And this book is going to have a look at everything to do with consent from the ground up. And this course that we're going to do right here is going to be a very shortened format, hitting again all of those main points. So what we first want to know about consent is that the whole idea of it is empowerment. It's empowering you, it's empowering your partner. And the whole reason why we need to practice consent is it keeps everyone safe and it keeps everyone healthy. Now, as we talk about this stuff, there could be some triggers or something that come up in you. If you've gone through something that's been difficult or that's not been okay, first of all, I'm very sorry that that's happened to you. And second of all, we want to make sure everybody has a plan on how to stay safe if you find anything comes up as we're talking. So I want you to just quickly take a time out, hit pause in a second, and just look up a helpline or look up a resource in your area that you know you could call if you start to feel any kind of emotions or stuff come up. Jot that down, have it somewhere you can come back to. Now, once you have that done, another thing you might want is a pen and paper out. Hopefully you've had a chance to print out all of the handouts that we're going to look at. If not, again, push pause, take a moment, find those handouts and print them out as we go. Otherwise, pen and paper is going to be good to have nearby so that you can sort of jot down any questions you might have. Anything, again, because we're covering it sort of broadly here. We're not doing as deep of a dive. So if there's something we start to cover and you have more questions, you want to learn more about it, remember, you can go on to purchase and to look at the longer format course after this or get the book, which goes into the most amount of depth. But you can just jot down anything you want to ask a teacher, a parent, or another trusted source about. Another big main point to know before we start diving into our chapter 1 is that this whole course is around inclusivity and diversity. Now, we won't have a chance to use every example in every different orientation and every different sort of combination. So just know that, please, if we do use certain examples that are male, female, other, non-binary, anything like that, that these are things that can happen between any and all people, all orientations, all gender dynamics. So just have that in the back of your mind as we're exploring these different ideas. So because this is our short format, we're actually going to jump right in. So the first thing to know is in chapter 1, what we're going to cover through the rest of this video is the chapter called Sex and You. So the first topic, we're not going to cover it in too depth, but a couple of starter questions to get you thinking, is around the idea of readiness and identity. So before we think about introducing consent with a partner, we kind of want to think about, instead of having two strangers in the room, we should probably get to know ourselves well first. So this is doing a bit of an inventory, a check-in with ourselves of who we are, what we want, what we're ready for, how we see ourselves, looking at readiness and what we think we might be ready for around emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, around types of relationships, things like that. We also want to look at, when we think of the word sort of sex and intimacy, what do we mean? So throughout the rest of this whole little course here, we're going to look at the term sex a lot, or intimacy, and knowing that it's not just, again, sort of the standard version of sort of penis and vagina sex. It's also can be all sorts of types of intimacy. Because again, remembering if it's sort of a female and a female together, you're not going to get that sort of penis and vagina standard, original, old school definition. We have to make sure we're thinking about it in terms of all types of different levels of intimacy, because consent applies to everything from sort of kissing, making out, and everything kind of on from there. Okay. So once you have a sense of your identity, what you might think you're ready for, what you might think you want and don't want, we also want to get a sense then of what do we mean when we talk about consent, just as a sort of groundwork. We're going to get much more into this in the next video, but for now, kind of starting out with the idea that consent is that each partner has complete control over the feelings of and the realities of what, who, when, where, and why sex is happening. So who, what, when, where, why, and how sex is happening. So all of those question words are going to be important to that idea of consent. So before we kind of dive deeper into the idea of the definition of consent, we want to backtrack one little bit of a step here. And one of the things we want to think about is sort of dismantling maybe some of the ideas we already have about sex and consent, some that might serve us well, and maybe some that don't. So some that serve us well often come from our family, culture, sort of reputable sources like at school from your teachers if you're doing sex ed class and things like that. But we also want to understand some places that maybe we've gotten some ideas about what sex and consent looks like that aren't so healthy. Not every example is bad, but there's quite a few, unfortunately, in our sort of society, media, TV, advertisements that actually maybe don't serve us well in real life. And there's reasons for that, but we want to make sure we understand the difference between sort of entertainment we might see on TV and movies versus our own life. So a couple of those myths and influences are thinking about some of those common, very entertaining storylines that might not actually have a great deal to do with consent itself. So one of those classic storylines is this idea of, again, very gendered, a binary, so a male-female thing happening, which doesn't really represent reality. And it kind of tells the story a lot of sort of a guy chasing a girl, and a girl who sort of doesn't think she wants to be with the guy, and then the guy doing all these things to then eventually win her over. And then she eventually realizes that they were meant to be all along. And it's very interesting, fun, lighthearted thing to watch on a TV screen maybe, but in real life, that's actually not consent. So it's not one gender versus another. Someone's chasing, someone's winning. This is consent really in real life is two people agreeing and deciding that they are going to be intimate together because they both want to, not because one person's trying to win or convince over another person. We'll actually learn that's in fact not consent and not something we want to do. It's not actually, in some cases, not legal even. So that would be one storyline to kind of look out for. So other things to kind of look out for, other influences might also include pornography. While you may or may not choose to use this in your life, do know that there are some legal rules around this as well, around age that is sort of pornography is supposed to be viewed at or not for safety reasons. Again, sort of what's appropriate, what's going to be harmful, what might be, a little bit too much to view at certain ages. Now, that being said, there's also no shame in it. So if it is something that you are happening to look at, understanding what you're looking at. Pornography is also something that is really not made for educational purposes. It's made for specifically the stimulation visually and auditorily, like what we hear, for the person watching it. So the people on the screen, the things that they're doing and how they're interacting with each other isn't really how things happen in real life. Okay, so I won't dive too much deeper into that. We go into much more of that in the book as well as in the longer course format. But just as a starting place, know that that's, again, not a great model to start with if you're looking at how to be intimate with another person in real life. Another social pressure to know about is, again, that sort of social factor that sometimes we may have peers or a feeling of rules or what we're supposed to do. And just remember that there is no supposed to with consent other than the sort of rules of proper and healthy consent. So if it's rules more like you're supposed to have game, or you're supposed to, again, win people over, or there's a game that everyone's playing like a truth or dare or spin the bottle, knowing that those rules aren't binding. Everyone has the right and ability to say no at any time, regardless of any sort of pre-perceived notions that might be out there. So just having a sense of what those myths and influences are. Again, there's a lot more examples in the book and in the longer course format. If you're interested in learning more, make sure you check those out. Now, going from there, we want to make sure that we have a very good idea of what consent is. So the next chapter we're going to look at is chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the idea of what is consent. We're going to look at consent in the law, and we're going to look at all the different elements that make up everything to do with consent. So to wrap this part up, you have your first handout for this little mini course. And the mini course, the first handout asks you to do this sort of readiness checklist. So the readiness checklist just has sort of different elements here that all incorporate different aspects of consent. Some, like I said, we'll cover in depth here, and some will just more brush over, so you know it's something you might need to pay a little bit more attention to. You're just between 1 and 4, rating your comfort, how well you're familiar with it. And we'll come back to this sort of at the end after we've covered some of the basics. And you can just sort of note if there's anywhere you still want to increase your learning and something that you might still want to look more into. Okay, so starting with that wraps up our very first video for the short format course. And I will see you over in chapter 2.